Hello and welcome to this edition of Talking SUPs. In this episode, we're going to be looking at some of the marine and legal issues around single-use plastics. And to go through this fascinating topic, we have two experts in this field. We have Richard Thompson, who is a professor in marine biology at the University of Plymouth, and we have Jason Lowther, who is the associate professor in law, also at the University of Plymouth. Jason and Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on Talking SUPs.
Pleasure. Nice to be here.
Richard, I'm just going to ask you to kick off. Obviously, you've researched widely on the topic of single-use plastics, and particularly with its impact on the marine wildlife. So tell us a bit about what your research is saying about this issue and why it's a problem.
So I'm a marine biologist by training, and so I've been studying, I study the oceans, and I realized more than 20 years ago that actually a lot of the habitats that I looked at were contaminated, heavily contaminated by litter. Most of that litter was plastic litter. And if we break it down even further, the main category that we find is actually single-use plastic. And that's true when you look at global production statistics. We're now making 360 million tons or more of plastic every year. 40% of it is single-use. Now, I want to be clear, those single-use plastics can bring benefit. They can help to reduce wastage of food and drink, which is another major environmental problem. But of course, because their benefit to society is quite short-lived, they bring us this short-lived convenience, but their persistence of waste is very long-lived, and it's 40% of all the production of plastics. It means that they're quite a problem, and it explains why single-use plastics that are particularly prominent when we look at litter in the environment. Of course, I don't want to see, televisions and parts of cars and other things in the marine environment. It's not, I would say that single-use plastics are particularly bad compared to other types of litter. It's that they are predominant because their use is short-lived, but their persistence of waste is very long-lived. And also, to some extent, we've been trained, I think, over or more than all of my lifetime to use those plastics in a disposable way, to bring us convenience, to have that convenience for an instant of something we might buy, a packaged sandwich, and to throw the wrapper away without any conscience or care about it, that this is a valueless item that's brought with convenience, and what happens next doesn't matter. And I guess it's that needs to change, really. It's making sure we think about end of life right from the design stage, and it's really important for single-use items.
Yeah, and Jason, I know you come at this from a different angle, more legal angle. Your own research and some of your own work on that. What are you seeing as the parameters of that debate and why it's important?
Okay, so I just want to agree very much with that conditioned response that we have to the way that we deal with plastics and view them in the way that our lives currently. In legal terms, about a lot of the current thinking now is around life cycle, is about being able to ensure that certain and particularly single-use plastics are in some way phased out, in some way regulated, or at the same time looking at the chemical composition of what they might actually be, in terms of then being able to have some form of effective means of recycling rather than them being disposed of or going completely into an environment where we don't particularly want them to go to. There's been various measures that you'll probably want to talk about a little bit in detail a little bit later. Various bans that have occurred across Europe. There's the directive in respect of this at the moment that's going to be effective in a couple of years. We've also got UK legislation in respect of this. Scotland has also brought something in recently in relation to the restriction of certain types of plastics. But again, going back to the fact that there's a very beneficial use for some of them, then treading that fine line legally between trying to prevent something or impose liability on somebody for doing something that is ultimately beneficial otherwise is really quite difficult and tricky in many respects. So that's where my research and the research of one of my PhD students is currently targeted.
Yeah, brilliant. And again, the two of you, I think, have outlined really well there about the nuances in this debate and just how kind of complex in some respects it is. Richard, I want to go to you for the next question. It's about, now, obviously, one of the things that campaigners are trying to do is to get policymakers to take this seriously and to take action. So from your point of view, why should policymakers at a national and local level take this issue seriously?
Well, it's really clear now that plastics are accumulating literally on a global scale. It's difficult to find a natural habitat that is not contaminated by plastics. That's everything from the poles to the equator, from shallow shorelines right down to the deep sea. You know, if I take a submersible craft down to a place never before visited by humans, I find that our waste has beaten us there, and it's typically a lot of plastic that's beaten us there. There's also a substantial body of evidence around the harm that causes. And we could unpack that, but it would take a little while. But the evidence is really clear that there is substantial economic harm to nations, and a lot of that is disproportionate by the wealth of those nations. Some of the greater economic harm is caused to the countries that have less ability to tackle it. There's also very clear evidence of harm to wildlife, with hundreds of species known to encounter plastic, and also growing but already very strong evidence of harm to human health and well-being. So it's clear that there's a cost from the current business model, but that's an external cost. It's not a cost to the businesses that are making and designing those single-use plastics. It's a cost that's borne by wider society and by the environment. So I think it's really important that we put measures in place to make sure that we're not continuing to contaminate the environment in the manner that we've done so far. And what I would say there, you know, in terms of thinking about it from a glass half full perspective, if you like, this isn't about not using plastics. It's not a story about having to turn off the lights or not take long haul flights or not take fish from the oceans. I mean, typically the environmental challenge I deal with is the challenge, the problem, the issue in the environment is directly coupled to something us humans want. Now, if I look at plastics, we want to use plastics. They can bring societal benefit, even environmental benefit. If I think of things like solar panels, those benefits can absolutely be achieved without the need for this emission to the environment. So it's quite different to carbon emissions associated with a long-haul flight or driving a car around. It isn't necessarily about not using them. It's about learning to use them more responsibly than we have done. And you know, as Jason said, it's about things like reduce, reuse, recycle. But where the challenge comes is, I would say, the devil's in the detail. Those phrases came into sort of popularity in the 1970s on Environment Day. And yet they're still the phrases that I hear, the kind of mantra that I hear at the Oceans Conference in Lisbon last week, that we need to do more to reuse, recycle. We need to extend producer responsibility. Absolutely. We need to do all of those things. But what specific responsibility is it that we want a producer to take? What are the products that we would achieve a better kind of a better outcome if we design them for reuse versus recyclability, let's say? So there's evidence that I would say, academic, independent evidence, that we're missing at a granular scale to help us move from these overarching phrases, which of course are the direction of travel, to the specifics, and then also understanding how do those specifics vary between nations, between, you know, Europe and North America, which has quite sophisticated waste management infrastructure, but we still have a problem with the accumulation of litter in the environment. And other countries where I work, like Indonesia, where there are more substantial quantities in the environment, but actually the heart of the problem there is the lack of even the basic waste management infrastructure in some of the areas that I visit. So the solutions are going to vary a lot between different nations as well. But it's that granular level of evidence that I think is needed. I would say, to come back to your question, that actually I think now, unlike 20 years ago when I first started working on the topic, there is agreement from the public, policy and industry that the current use of plastics, the current business model, if you like, is unsustainable. So that's really good that we're all on the same page. The challenge is the specifics, I would say, of how to now act on and how to get it right, because the frustration I see with some policy measures and you know, interventions from industry is that they're sort of guessing. You know, we're banning a drinking straw, which isn't per se a bad thing to do, but it's going to have a trivial impact on the global problem. So we've got to be sure that we're investing in solutions that are going to have an effect at scale, and that we've got clarity that those interventions are really going to work. Because there is a risk that some of the things I see that they could make matters worse if they're not actually properly tested and tried.
Yeah. Okay. That's absolutely fine. And Jason, same question to you. Why should policymakers be taking this seriously at a national and local level?
I was going to pick it up on a couple of things there, but cost obligation is immense. I mean, being a little bit more prosaic and local about it, then the cost to a local community in terms of, say, lost tourist revenue because people think it's a dirty beach and they don't want to go there, then that becomes something. The obligations that have been created through Scottish legislation places the cost of remediation and the cost of enforcement on local authorities, and so local authorities have budgetary constraints and things that they need to think about in this sort of thing as well. And really, from a legal point of view, then I would very much endorse what Richard's saying about evidence, which, you know, law's all about that. And if you want to try and establish liability somewhere, you need the evidence to be able to say, well, actually, this is causing the harm, this is causing the problem, and this is how it's causing the harm. And so that's where it needs to be tweaked at some point to be able to do something about it. I mean, I do think as well that policymakers are taking it seriously in a way that perhaps they weren't. I mean, you know, the UK's 25-year environment plan, it's possibly not the most forthcoming in terms of how, but it certainly does have some quite strong statements in terms of where we'd like to be at some point. I think policymakers also probably need to take into account the fact that the challenge on all of this sort of stuff is enforcement. It's about actually making it work, because if it doesn't, you can have as many laws as you like about something, but they will remain ineffective, and the problem won't go away. So I think probably that would be my key message, why they would want to be taking this seriously and doing something further about it.
Yeah, and obviously the two of you have linked into this as well in terms of actually concrete measures being based upon evidence. I mean, Richard, I know that there's no silver bullet on this, but if you were, I'm going to make you environment secretary for a day. If you were in there and you had to develop kind of some concrete measures, what are the things we should be looking at, and what are the aspects of policy that we should be pursuing?
So in terms of evidence, and it's not necessarily to say that we don't have, in some of the evidence, we have it, but it isn't all together. It isn't synthesized in any way. I think what's needed initially is actually to bring together experts from across different disciplines. So I come to this as an environmental scientist, a marine biologist that counts the things in the sea. But to actually solve the problem, we need to bring in people that are involved in material science that might be able to create new polymers that have greater capacity for recycling via a circular economy. We need to have involved product designers, but we also need social scientists that can understand how each and every one of us that interacts with plastic on a daily basis are likely to respond to these changes, whether it's a change in the product format for shampoo, or whether it's tax on a single-use item like a carrier bag. We need to understand whether or not those measures are actually going to be effective. And we also need legal experts like Jason, and we need experts that work in communication. So we need to bring all of those different disciplines and possibly more together in order to be able to identify, and I'd say it's not, as you said, there's no silver bullet. I think what I would be looking for would be clear evidence that said from a range of different perspectives, looking at this in different angles, if we do X, Y, and Z, let's say in the UK, that would definitely have a positive outcome compared to business as usual. Whereas if we do A, B, and C, we've got much less confidence that actually it's really going to turn the dial forward. And you could look at that through a lens in a more developing nation as well. And you might come up with are slightly different. 3 things that we're likely to achieve the most. I don't think we're looking at hundreds of different solutions globally, but I think you've got to match them to the local context. And I think that is about pulling together the evidence base. So to me, that is a critical next step. I think that some of that evidence is there. It's not that we need to go off and do long-winded studies. Of course, we need to move towards progress with some urgency, but it's about bringing together these perspectives to make sure we're making informed decisions as an absolute minimum, and starting to fill evidence gaps where they might be needed. You know, I mean, if I look at product design and I ask, are there any products that are specifically designed to maximize their circularity, their recyclability? And I think there are actually very few. If I go in the supermarket, there are some products that a recycler will say to me, yeah, I reckon with that one, I could probably recycle it 20 times. But that's not because it's been designed with that in mind. It's just because by coincidence, as a consequence of a total lack of thought, it just happens to work. So imagine what we could do if we really put our thinking caps on and started to gather that evidence about how, you know, and recycling, it's not all about that, but there is a better job we could do to move the dial beyond 10% of current production being recycled if we actually designed for it. So there's evidence needs there. Then I think in terms of policies, I think there may be some quite generic things that we can introduce at the moment. And we're seeing it in the 25-year UK plan. You're right, Jason. But to mandate a move towards recycled content will be a really strong pull towards making those changes at the design stage. If we're saying that all new products have got to have a certain quantity of recycled content in them, that will help to ensure that what we're making is compatible with that end of life. Whereas at the moment, the recycling streams are sort of at the whim of the price of fossil oil and gas. At the moment, we know that the price of fossil oil and gas is really high. So recycled plastic is actually relatively cost effective. But at times when the price of fossil oil and gas is low, then it's difficult for those recycling streams to compete. And some of them have gone out of business. Immense investment in plants has been lost because they couldn't sell the material because of not a volatility in their prices, but a volatility in the competitor, which is the fossil oil and gas. So measures to, if you like, secure the market for recycled plastic. So really, they're quite generic tools. I think that's the last thing. I need to go to Jason. You know, he's more the expert on the legal frameworks, but I guess I would say there's a limit to the things that you can ban. Yes, we've put a bag and we've banned microbeads in cosmetics, but actually we need some instruments that will drag, you know, all of society and industry in the right direction. Mandating recycled content feels like a good tool. You know, we still need evidence around it. There could be some unintended side effects, for instance, if people started to substitute for other materials that actually presented their own challenges. So we need to be sure that we've got the evidence around the edges too.
Brilliant, and that's a really great insight. Jason, your thoughts on that as well?
Just on the types of material, absolutely, we can't go around banning absolutely everything because where would we end up with that? But the EU directive on this at the moment on single-use plastics that comes into force throughout the member states on totally by 2024, and is going to still have an effect on the UK, because if the UK wants to sell into the EU market, its products are going to have to conform. And so there's a couple of nice little examples really of the kind of more systems thinking approach to this. So we all know at the moment that it's difficult to recycle the tops of plastic bottles, whether that's milk, Coke, whatever it happens to be. And there's an obligation within the directive that member states by 2024 work out some way that they're made of the same material, or they're made of a similar material that can be dealt with in the same way. There's equally an obligation to increase the recovery rates to, I think it's 77% off the top of my head, for plastic bottles, particularly as a particular problematic waste stream. Again, there's an emphasis on the consumer here, which worries me in some respects, because it's not just the consumer that's causing the problem. In fact, most of the time it isn't. But also to make the consumer aware and manufacturers to make consumers aware of reusable alternative products, and also to label products that are not reusable, and be quite loud about that, so that people will make informed decisions and informed choices on that basis. Which again, it's kind of trying to frame this through an economic lens, which is okay. It's probably the thing that's going to drive progress in some respects, and also get us away from the sort of relatively blunt instrument of saying, right, you can't do this anymore, this is banned, here's a sanction should that actually happen. One of the things that, if I can just drop that in, is the frustration with this, whether it's at EU level, whether it's at national level, whether it's at international level. There is a constant mantra about education about plastics. The public need to be educated about I don't see how this needs to continue from the perspective that we've been talking about it for 20 years. And the educational message, I would have hoped, would have got through at some point. But we know that there's a treaty being developed. It will give us some clues, I think, as to the level of commitment that the international community is willing to place on these sorts of things. And just very briefly, if I was Environment Minister for a day, I think my my first short-term activity would be to really lobby for the banning, and I am going to use a ban here, of the export of plastics for recycling anywhere. It's pretty much banned anyway, but it still goes on. And that's what I would be after, because placing the materials in circumstances where they can't be properly dealt with really does contribute massively to the problem nationally, internationally. So that would be my first short-term fix, I think.
Brilliant. Richard and Jason, thank you so much for coming along and giving your insights. We've just I appreciate it's the tip of the iceberg for what we've just talked about, but I think the three of you and your expertise have outlined some of the issues very well, and you've given a lot of food for thought about the nuances of the debate, and also some ideas about where we need to go with it as well. So you've been listening to Jason Lowther, who is Associate Professor in Law at the University of Plymouth, and Richard Thompson, who is a Professor in Marine Biology. Thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thanks for asking us, David. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Talking SUPs. Please remember to hit the subscribe button so that you can keep up to date with all future episodes from this series. Thank you for watching.